And so it began again. And in the south, an arc of cold yearned northward. And in the north, a great plume of fire yearned south. And they met at last, or they met already, for no time was. And the two created steam and ice, tumult and sound. And out of the tumult was forged a figure. Great, it seemed. For between fire and ice had been before void, and the figure grew immense, and so it filled all the void, and at last opened its two eyes. Hollow, for there was nothing to see. And so it was, before man, before woman, Ymir the Great. And Ymir was in the void, and all else was fire and ice for a little while. But on Ymir's left hand, where it reached the cold, ice seemed to form, and the ice melted when it caught up with the warmth of Ymir's body and formed drops. And those drops became Ymir's first children. But on the other hand, he sweated, and the sweat seemed to be evaporated by the flame and became his second children. And they danced upon Ymir's hand, and Ymir laughed and laughed. And Ymir laughed and laughed. But each time Ymir laughed, fire belted out, and frost, and all those children were destroyed, but yet more were born. And so it went on and on and on. But Ymir, in the hollows that were his eyes, suddenly started to see not only his children, but there where the ice was being melted by the fire, something was emerging. A great cow. And the cow came to him and gave him milk. And that was the first thing he had ever eaten, and he chuckled like a child, and all his children chuckled like children too. And Ymir dwelt with the cow in the void. But the cow was busy, and Ymir watched, and it was licking always the same spot in the ice, always the same place, and gradually, oh so gradually, a figure emerged, a second figure. And there was then a bolt of flame, and it melted all the ice around the figure, and it opened its eyes and stood up and looked Ymir in the face. Smaller than he it was, much smaller, and yet with a power he hated at once. And he called upon the frost, and he called upon the fire, and it split the figure. And it split the figure into three. And the three figures scuttled across the ice and were lost. But as Ymir looked, the cow had gone, disappearing into the void. All that it left in its stead was a trail of milk that lies in the void to this day, although it is said in a different place. And Ymir and his children, sometimes many, sometimes few, dwelt long in that space of void until he heard it. At first he thought it must be a dream, and then just another tumult. And then he heard it all clearer. The plain marching of feet. And suddenly, across the ice, he saw the three figures had come back, but they had made from the frost many others. like themselves. And they poured onto him, and there was war upon his knees, upon his hands, as his children fought against the newcomers. And they fought hard, his children. And seeing that, he inhaled first the cold children, and they went down into his left lung. And then he inhaled the fiery children into his right, only just in time. For just at that moment, although they had lost many in the struggle, the strangers had taken his arms, and the tallest and brightest of the strangers, one of the first of the three who had merged, was upon his shoulder, and the figure stared at him boldly, and in their hand they held a mighty spear, and before Ymir could move, the spear smote him full in the forehead. Full in the forehead, and with a scream like creation itself that echoes throughout time, Ymir fell. And Odin, the master of the spear, declared his triumph. And then he and his two brethren, if brethren they were in this world before man and woman ever was, took the body of Ymir. And as they watched, one last sweat stood out from the body, and they swept that sweat away, wanting to forget it, and warmed to their task. They and what little people were left to them, some mighty warriors, some less mighty. They split then the body of Ymir, and from the skin and the ribs they built and moulded a Middle Earth, built with magnificence. And from his long bones, again moulded over skin, they built great mountains. His lungs, they could see, had something still inside them, and so they thrust them to the north and to the south. And his visceral parts, they hated the sight of. And they, the strongest of the three original, threw the gut away, where they were draining the blood, where after would be the ocean. And then Odin took the skull of Ymir, and he emptied it, pouring the contents down he knew where. And he threw also the heart that still seemed to beat a little, down there somewhere beyond time. And he took also the liver and put it down in the same place. And when he felt they must have fallen, he took then the backbone and rooted it down deep, not really caring where it was, for he was a young god, full in his power. And then he put the top of the skull of Ymir to build the dome of heaven. And the milk of the cow they spread across that dome to be a reminder of what was before anything was. And they took the eyes of Ymir, and in one, Odin summoning up the flame, for it seemed now to be at his command, ignited the sun, and the other he ignited as the moon from the cold, and he set them in the skies. And then the great gods gathered in council. The mid-afternoon they created, and the midday, midwinter and midsummer, to mark the passage of the years, and so created the pattern of time. But as they watched, from those little gut parts and parts of Ymir's innards they had left there upon his bright skin, there emerged 7 maggots. And as they watched, 3 of the maggots seemed to burrow down, looking for the innards they had put deep down in the earth. And the other 4 grew into little men with long beards, hard and knobbly as time. And Odin smiled and said, "Dwarfs." And he put one in the north, one in the south, one in the east, and one in the west, to hold up the dome of the sky. And now his conjuring was nearly complete. But he and his 2 originals, Ve and Vili, stood at last up at the backbone, and there they sung a song of such power. There they sung a song of such might that the bones seemed to take root. It became a mighty tree, the one tree, the yew tree, upon which all the parts of Ymir was arranged, all the worlds built from lung, built from body, built from bone. And the teeth then they set as precious gems and threw them on the world, but kept a great part for themselves. And they laughed in their joy, and laughter filled heaven, and filled the world like light. And looking down on the world, they saw that it had teemed and multiplied, for the dwarfs that had fled into the depths had become many, breeding somehow dwarf fashion, and they dwelt in the depths. Well, the sweat that had come after Ymir's death had become people, and they seemed to be divided into two parts, but not divided, Odin noted, according to hot and cold, but form, strong and graceful, and he wondered at it. But he didn't want other people, not here, dwelling on his Middle Earth, and so one last time he opened the skull of Ymir and called down a tempest and blew the tall, graceful figures quite away, willing them to go into a world of their own and make in their own void their own creation. And so he banished the elves. But Odin and his two brothers they were, went down into the world. And they came then across a great forest, and there were fallen in the forest an elm and an ash. And Odin looked, and he saw the shadow of his great brother Ve, the strongest of all creatures, lying on the shadow, and with his hand he sketched out that form. And then he saw Vele's shadow, and it was graceful and thin, and he sketched out that form. And then from the two forms he sketched out, one made from elm, one from ash, he pulled out man and woman. And as he looked up, that who was Ve became Thor, his brother. And that who was Vele became Freya, became Frigg, his wife. And so man and woman were created, in God and in men in that moment. And Odin became the All-Father, the Val-Father, and great was the rejoicing of heaven, and great the joy of earth, as the gods climbed back up into the very ark of heaven, and sat and looked on their world. And for Odin it seemed so good. And after many years, when the world was full, Odin climbed up, for the first time in so long, to the ash tree. And he thought of Ymir, and he reached out and touched the tree, and for one horrible moment, the tree seemed to be as bone, and his hand seemed to be red with blood again, as it had been he had killed Ymir. And as he touched the tree, he realized he could not move the hand, for something was coming deep from within. And he looked down, and there they came. Up the great stalk they came. 3 giant maids, it seemed, from giant land. One made from the brain, one from the liver, one from the heart. Past, present, and future. This is a murder of time. And Odin at last fell back as the 3 Norns arrived, and started, some said, from the very guts of Ymir itself that they had retrieved from the void, to weave fates of gods and men, elves and dwarves, trolls, there in heaven, high in the arc of Ymir's skull. They remembered always his fate. And so it all began.